Hi, I'm Emily. As you just said, I'm from Art and Writing, and my presentation is an analysis of the reaction to David Beckham being photographed in a sarong, the impact that it had, and what it tells us about gender, and it also opens up for a wider discussion around performance and masculinity. So these are the two main questions that I'm going to be looking at and kind of aiming to answer today. And those are, how can masculinity be performed, and in what ways is it acceptable to perform masculinity? So, as I said, I'm using David Beckham as a case study to explore this, as the reception of his gender identity really ranges depending on the context. So, I'm sure that everybody knows who David Beckham is, but if you don't know, he's a very famous footballer, and really he was the first, if not one of the first, to really market himself outside of football and kind of transcend from being a footballer to all-round celebrity. So essentially what we're looking at is the ways in which he in particular performed his masculinity, and whether he was able to subvert traditional masculine ideals and just the discourse that surrounded him at the time. So I'm going to give just a little bit of historical context, even though the 90s wasn't that long ago. But in the 90s, there really began this emergence of a term that is now coined the New Lad theory. And this was coined by Rosalind Gill, and she states that the New Lad is depicted as hedonistic, post, if not anti-feminist, and preeminently concerned with beer, football, and shagging women. And a lot of the responsibility for the emergence of this New Lad idea was attributed to Loaded magazine, which there's a few examples of up there. And this was really at the forefront of men's culture in the 90s, and it glorified this kind of laddish behaviour and basically exemplified this new phenomenon. And the New Lad was really held up by other prolific figures at the time, including footballers like Vinnie Jones, as well as the band Oasis, all of whom have been on the cover of Loaded magazine. So really the attitudes at the time were quite rigid, and for a man in football, it's definitely fair to say that there was an expectation that David Beckham would fit into this archetype. However, pretty early on in his career, he chose not to conform to this New Lad behaviour in the way that might have been expected. So the first and one of the most famous instances of his non-conformity is when he was photographed wearing a sarong. So the Sun reported on it, as well as Telegraph and Argus, with somewhat demeaning and kind of mocking comments. It's really interesting to note as well that the Sun article I've got on the right was originally online, but after the documentary came out, it mysteriously disappeared, and it was replaced by one that actually praised him and called him a fashion icon for wearing it. But I was able to find this image of the actual paper when it came out. And in Telegraph and Argus, they actually interviewed a number of members of the public and got their reaction to it. And some of the quotes were things like, "I don't like it, men should be in trousers." And another person suggested that maybe if you're on holiday, it's acceptable, but not around here and not in England. And you can see within the article that it also questions, would football fans be able to cheer for a bloke with 3 lions on his skirt? And David Beckham also commented on this recently and recalled the public's reaction, describing it as outraged. So there is a suggestion among theorists that there are 2 different David Beckhams. There's the David Beckham that's the husband, footballer, father, and then the other one is the celebrity and icon, and that these 2 people exist independently. And as I will go on to suggest, the latter David Beckham was actually afforded a lot more freedom. But in 1998, when this image came out, he had not really reached that icon status, meaning that the only kind of bodily context we were able to view this on was David Beckham, the footballer. So when we know this, then the only way that the sarong could have been received was as a retaliation to this lad culture that was really coming about at the time, and it framed him as something to be criticised and mocked. In these reports, he was also kind of othered in a sense. So Hegel suggests that the other is someone that doesn't fit into societal expectations, someone that cannot be understood, and essentially he suggests that the other is a perversion of the truth. So when we apply that in this context, we can kind of understand that the sarong is the perversion and the new lad theory is the truth. And if we draw from film theorist Laura Mulvey's ideas, we understand that another way he was othered was through his performance in itself. So Mulvey suggests that men do the looking and women are the ones to be looked upon. But as you can see in this image, Victoria Beckham's really in the background and she looks down while he's at the forefront, looking directly at the camera, kind of suggesting that he's making himself the one to be looked at. And this in itself would suggest that he's subverting ideas around masculinity. So another example of his performance is the cover of Loaded that he did himself. So here he's sort of pictured under this warm sunlight lighting. It's very easy for the eye to behold, and he's a very non-threatening presence to the looker. And his smile to the camera kind of suggests that he's happy to perform, he's happy to have his photograph taken, and the text that they've used, so I'll be on the cover then right, kind of only furthers this idea that he delights in his own performance, and there's a suggestion with that text that he is perhaps vain. So we can clearly read the text as the magazine kind of poking fun at him, and despite the fact that masculinity is very often linked to kind of looks and status, I guess the indulgence and the knowledge and caring about them is seen as womanly. So there is little evidence for how this cover was received by the public, but it does tell us how he was being positioned in the media at this time. So Laura Mulvey tells us that to perform in itself is to undermine masculinity. However, there were other men at this time who held a similar status, a similar job and kind of place in society that also partook in performance without receiving the same backlash. And this was primarily a result of the way in which they positioned themselves. So Vinnie Jones is kind of the perfect example of this, especially when we compare his Loaded magazine cover to David Beckham's. So his is black and white, it's very stark, he's topless and smoking a cigar. And while David Beckham smiled at the camera, Vinnie Jones kind of squints at the camera, and that suggests that this is perhaps a candid photo that he didn't want to be taken, and it suggests that he doesn't delight in this kind of performance and being watched. But this in itself is still a performance, even though it's a more brute, aggressive kind. It resides far more within the bounds of the new lad, and it didn't garner the same kind of criticism. And these attitudes to how gender is performed tie in much more with Judith Butler's theories around gender. So she suggests that gender is always a performance and describes it as a constructed identity and a performative accomplishment. So we begin to understand that then it's not the performance itself that garners the criticism, but it's the way in which it is performed. So we can understand this further again when we consider that the football pitch itself is a stage. So Man United's Old Trafford has actually been dubbed the Theatre of Dreams, suggesting it's a stage in which the players perform. And David Beckham was really praised for his performance for England and Man United. This is pictures of the celebrations, which are, facing directly to the crowd, and it's definitely a performance. So it was only when he was off the pitch and he wore clothing such as the sarong that he received criticism. So in order to kind of fully explore his gender representation, we do have to address the underlying queer coding that was present throughout his career and how this impacted the way that his masculinity was presented and received. So David Beckham has actually been dubbed a gay icon, and he has embraced this, and this is a picture of him on the cover of Attitude magazine, which is a gay men's lifestyle magazine. So in Jason Mitchell's book, A Culture of Silence, he explores homophobia within the sport of football, and he conducted a study at Stonewall Football Club and found that many queer fans believe that football is an anti-gay sport. He also writes about how there is a lack of openly homosexual players in the sport of football. So from this, we can understand that queer representations in football are scarce. And Aidan and Ross write that fashion consciousness can be perceived as antagonizing heterosexuality because male fashion as well deconstructs traditional ideas of masculinity. And when we couple this with what Connell writes, which is that homosexuality is a negation of masculinity, we can understand that David Beckham's kind of evolving persona was posing a threat to heterosexuality and, as a result, football itself. So he did continue to play with these kind of masculine boundaries, but later on in his career, he was really able to negate criticism, and this was primarily through the media's insistence on his straightness. So Aidan and Ross also write that David Beckham epitomizes the approach that lads magazines take, which is that it's okay to be a peacock as long as you are a footballer and as long as you are seen as heterosexual. And there is definitely weight to this argument, as today there's been a real lack of consequence for David Beckham, who has maintained a very long and lucrative career despite the social criticism at the time. However, Judith Butler writes that those who fail to do their gender right are regularly punished. So we can understand that the social criticism was the punishment. Another issue that I personally take with Aidan and Ross's theory is that I don't think it's quite enough just to be seen as heterosexual. So in the sarong photograph, he is pictured with his now wife, Victoria Beckham, which really supports his heterosexuality, but still that wasn't quite enough to allow him to negate social criticism. And this is furthered in his career. So these are images from the 2002 GQ campaign that he did, which is a 6-page spread that is heavily queer-coded, and they serve as a perfect example of how David Beckham's sexuality was kind of asserted only 4 years after the sarong incident. So in one image here, we see him in this cheetah print thong, and then in that image, he's in these like denim cut-offs, and he's heavily oiled up, and he's looking right into the camera, and obviously, you know, in that one, he's very much delighting within his own image, and the cover reads that this is his most outrageous shoot. So he's feminized really through this imagery. In this picture on the right, he's wearing nail polish, which I know now isn't really a big deal, but back then it arguably was a much bigger deal. But all of these images are kind of offset by use of other imagery. So in the background of this first one, he's got the weights and he's got the sort of pin-up style images of women. And then in this one, he's holding a football, there's the football trophy next to him. And these all play in again to that kind of macho masculine archetype. So even though he's playing with this femininity and kind of gender and sexuality, there's always this very strong assertion of his straightness. You're constantly reminded that he is straight, that he's a footballer, and that, you know, yeah. So when we look at this, again, in conjunction with the sarong, where he's also demonstrating this femininity, the reaction to these two is markedly different. As in the sarong image, despite the presence of Victoria Beckham, the public aren't really guided in the same way to accept the femininity. So we can understand that really there needs to be clear imagery that directs the viewer to accept that the feminization is a performance and that his real identity is still clear. So I think what else is important to mention is the audience that was expected of these images. So these were GQ Images, which is a men's lifestyle magazine. So while it would be assumed that women would be the primary audience for these images, the intended audience was actually men. And this again makes the assertion of his straightness much more important. So Simone de Beauvoir writes that women appear essentially to the male as a sexual being, and for him, she is sex. But in these images, David Beckham puts himself in the position to be looked upon, So using Beauvoir's theory, we can understand that David Beckham is taking on the role of the woman and taking on the role of the sex object to be viewed by other men. So D.V. Chow writes on the idea of the locker room that the locker room becomes structured in a very binary way. It's a public site of male homosociality and a closeted site of male homosexuality. And while he does critique this view of the locker room, this theory in this context can be said to be represented by the magazine. The magazine kind of serves as this locker room space in which men can indulge in the sexual fantasies centered around the voyeurism and looking at other men, which again makes this kind of assertion of his straightness much more important. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so to conclude, there's really no doubt that the media circulation that surrounded David Beckham was really entrenched in the discourse around his masculinity, and that we can root much of the criticism that he faced to his willingness to change attitudes. However, it's clear that while that statement remains true, David Beckham still really does hold up these pillars of masculinity, and we can say that he was really afforded the ability to play with these boundaries because he was a heterosexual male, and that this was always reiterated to the audience. So going back to my initial questions, how can masculinity be performed, and in what ways can masculinity be performed? It's clear that it can be performed, but it has to exist within certain boundaries.